bound by the truth. Lady Eleanor of Ashbourne had once placed all her trust in Sir Tristan de Warwick until he vanished without a word. Now, as she prepared to wed another, he stood in the doorway of the great hall, his voice rough with something unspoken. "Did you ever grieve for me, Eleanor?" he murmured. "Or did you simply forget?" Chapter 1. The Ghost in the Great Hall. The Great Hall of Ashbourne Castle was a tapestry of flickering torchlight and nervous energy. The air, thick with the scent of roasted boar and spiced wine, did little to soothe Lady Eleanor's frayed nerves. Tonight, she was to be formally betrothed to Lord Beaumont, a man of considerable wealth and influence, but lacking the spark that had once set her soul alight. Her fingers, tracing the intricate carvings of the high-backed chair, felt cold despite the nearby hearth fire. She was a woman past her first blush of youth, her beauty refined by time and tinged with a lingering sadness that even the finest silks and jewels could not conceal. Eleanor's gaze drifted across the assembled guests. Lords and ladies, their faces flushed with wine and anticipation, whispered amongst themselves. The Beaumont contingent, led by the lord himself, a man whose girth strained the seams of his richly embroidered doublet, occupied the place of honor at the high table. He was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, and tonight that included her. Eleanor understood the necessity of this union. Her brother, Baron Ashbourne, had made that abundantly clear. The alliance would secure their lands, protect their people, and restore their family's dwindling fortunes. Duty. It was a heavy cloak she had worn for most of her life. A sudden hush fell over the hall. The massive oak doors, reinforced with iron bands, creaked open, revealing not the expected page announcing the evening's entertainment, but a figure cloaked and hooded, standing silhouetted against the fading twilight. A collective gasp rippled through the assembly. The figure moved with a warrior's grace, the soft clink of mail audible beneath the heavy fabric of his cloak. He strode forward, his steps measured and deliberate, drawing every eye in the hall. Eleanor felt a tremor run through her. There was something familiar about the man's bearing, a sense of contained power that resonated deep within her. As he approached the high table, he pushed back his hood, revealing a face etched with the hardships of time and battle. Hair, once the color of raven's wings, was now streaked with silver, framing eyes that were the same startling shade of blue she remembered so vividly. Eyes that had once held laughter and warmth, now held a haunting melancholy. It was Sir Tristan de Warwick, the man she had loved. The man who had vanished without a trace 5 years ago, leaving her heartbroken and adrift. The man who was supposed to be dead. A wave of dizziness washed over Eleanor. Her hand flew to her chest, her fingers clutching at the heavy gold cross that lay beneath her gown. It was a gift from Tristan, given on the eve of his departure for the king's service. A silent vow of his return. A vow he had broken. Lord Beaumont rose, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Who dares interrupt this gathering?" he boomed, his voice echoing through the hall. Tristan ignored him, his gaze locked on Eleanor. He moved closer, stopping just a few feet from where she sat, frozen in her chair. The silence in the hall was absolute, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the frantic beat of Eleanor's heart. He spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the hall. "Did you ever grieve for me, Eleanor?" he murmured, the words laced with a pain that mirrored her own. "Or did you simply forget?" The question hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Eleanor's carefully constructed composure crumbled. Memories, long suppressed, flooded her mind. The stolen moments, the whispered promises, the agonizing farewell. The endless days and nights spent waiting for a word, a sign, anything to tell her he was still alive. The slow, agonizing acceptance that he was gone, lost to the endless wars that plagued the land. She had grieved, deeply, a grief that had hollowed her out, leaving her a shell of the woman she once was. But she had also learned to survive, to rebuild, to accept the dictates of duty and fate. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision. She struggled to find her voice, to answer the question that had ripped open the carefully sealed wounds of her heart. Forget? She whispered, the word of fragile breath. How could I forget the man who held my heart in his hands? A flicker of something relief, perhaps, or a renewed pain crossed Tristan's face. He took another step closer, his hand reaching out as if to touch her, then hesitating, hovering in the air between them. The unspoken question, the unfulfilled promise, hung heavy in the space that separated them. The years, the unanswered questions, the impending betrothal to another man, all of it formed an insurmountable barrier. A barrier built on broken oaths and shattered dreams. Chapter 2. Whispers of the Past. The great hall remained suspended in a tableau of shock and anticipation. Lord Beaumont, his face now a thunderous red, moved to step between Tristan and Eleanor, but Baron Ashbourne, Eleanor's brother, swiftly intervened. He placed a restraining hand on Beaumont's arm, his eyes fixed on the returned knight. Sir Tristan, Baron Ashbourne said, his voice carefully neutral, your presence is unexpected. We had all believed you lost. He gestured towards a nearby chair. Perhaps you would care to explain yourself after you have taken some refreshment. Tristan's gaze flickered to Ashbourne, a hint of suspicion in his eyes. He had known Geoffrey Ashbourne since childhood, had trained alongside him, fought beside him. But much could change in 5 years. Trust was a fragile thing, easily broken, especially in these turbulent times. He slowly lowered himself into the offered chair, never taking his eyes off Eleanor. She sat rigidly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The initial shock was giving way to a torrent of conflicting emotions. Anger at his unexplained absence. Relief that he was alive. Fear of what his return meant for her carefully constructed future. And beneath it all, a flicker of the love she had thought long extinguished. A servant hurried forward, offering Tristan a goblet of wine. He took it, but barely touched it to his lips. His attention was solely on Eleanor, on deciphering the emotions that played across her face. He saw the pain, the confusion, the guardedness. He also saw a flicker of something else, something that sent a jolt of hope through him, a hope he had dared not entertain for years. I owe you an explanation, Eleanor, he said, his voice low and rough, and I will give it. But not here. Not in front of everyone. He glanced pointedly at Lord Beaumont, who was still simmering with barely contained rage. Eleanor hesitated. The thought of being alone with Tristan, of confronting the ghosts of their past, terrified her. But she also knew she could not deny him, or herself, the answers she desperately craved. Very well, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. We shall speak in the solar. After the evening meal. The solar, a private chamber adjacent to the great hall, was a sanctuary of sorts. It was where Eleanor often retreated to escape the pressures of courtly life, to read, to sew, to simply be alone with her thoughts. The room was warmly lit by candles and a crackling fire, casting long shadows on the tapestries that adorned the walls. As the heavy oak door closed behind them, shutting out the noise and bustle of the great hall, an almost unbearable silence descended. Eleanor turned to face Tristan, her heart pounding in her chest. 5 years, she said, her voice trembling slightly. 5 years I waited, prayed, mourned. And then, nothing. Not a word, not a sign. Do you have any idea what that did to me? Tristan looked down at his hands, the firelight glinting off the worn leather of his gloves. He seemed to have aged beyond his years, the lines around his eyes and mouth etched deep with sorrow and regret. I know, he said, his voice barely a whisper. And I am deeply sorry. I would have given anything to spare you that pain. But I was prevented from contacting you. Prevented? Eleanor's voice rose in disbelief. By whom? By what? He hesitated, a shadow of fear crossing his face. It is a long story, Eleanor. A story of betrayal, of imprisonment, of oaths broken and loyalties tested. A story that could endanger us both if spoken aloud in the wrong company. He looked up at her, his blue eyes pleading for understanding. Trust me, Eleanor. Just for a little while longer. I promise you, I will tell you everything. But I need to know, can you still trust me, even after all this time? The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their shared past and the uncertain future. Eleanor searched his face, looking for any sign of deceit, any hint of the man who had once betrayed her trust. But all she saw was pain, regret, and a desperate longing that mirrored her own. The love she had thought dead stirred within her, a fragile ember glowing in the ashes of her heart. It was a dangerous feeling, a reckless hope. But she could not deny it. I want to, she whispered, the words a fragile confession. And at that moment a silent promise was formed, fragile as it may be. Chapter 3. The Falcon's Flight. The hours that followed the tense exchange in the solar were a blur of forced civility and simmering undercurrents. Eleanor, seated beside Lord Beaumont at the high table, felt Tristan's gaze upon her throughout the meal. It was a gaze that spoke volumes of regret, of longing, and of a warning she couldn't quite decipher. Beaumont, oblivious to the silent communication, droned on about his hunting dogs and the upcoming harvest, his conversation punctuated by loud guffaws and boasts of his wealth. Eleanor responded with polite nods and carefully worded phrases, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and trepidation. She noticed how Tristan interacted with her brother, Baron Ashbourne. They spoke in low tones, their heads close together, their expressions serious. There was a familiarity there, the bond of men who had shared experiences, both good and bad. But Eleanor also sensed a subtle tension, a guardedness that made her uneasy. What secrets were they sharing? What plans were being hatched? After the seemingly endless meal, as the guests began to disperse, Eleanor excused herself and made her way to the castle gardens. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the stifling atmosphere of the great hall. She found solace in the familiar scent of roses and lavender, the gentle murmur of the fountain, the soft glow of the moon filtering through the leaves of the ancient oak trees. She wasn't surprised when Tristan found her there. He moved with a quiet grace, his footsteps barely disturbing the gravel path. He stopped a few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back. The gardens have not changed, he said, his voice soft, almost wistful. Some things endure, Eleanor replied, her gaze fixed on the moonlit blossoms. He was silent for a moment, then spoke again, his voice laced with a hint of pain. I remember we used to meet here, in secret. Before Eleanor closed her eyes, the memories flooding back. The stolen kisses, the whispered promises, the heady rush of young love. It seemed a lifetime ago, a world away from the cold reality of her present situation. We were different people then, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Were we? Tristan challenged, taking a step closer. Or have we simply been forced to become different? He reached out and gently touched a stray curl that had escaped her carefully arranged braids. The touch sent a shiver through her, a jolt of electricity that awakened senses she had thought long dormant. Tell me, she pleaded, her voice trembling. Tell me what happened. Tell me why you disappeared. Tristan looked up at the sky, his face etched with pain. I was sworn to secrecy, Eleanor. An oath I took on my honor as a knight. But that oath, it was used against me. Twisted, manipulated. He began to pace, his movements agitated. I was sent on a mission, ostensibly for the king. But it was a trap. A plot orchestrated by those who sought to remove me from the picture. Remove you? Eleanor whispered, her heart pounding. But why? Because I knew too much, Tristan said, his voice low and dangerous. Because I was a threat to their ambitions. Because he stopped hesitating. Because I loved you. He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a raw intensity that took her breath away. Your family, Eleanor, they are not as innocent as you believe. There are secrets, dark secrets, that lie hidden beneath the surface of Ashbourne's noble facade. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden falcon. It was a miniature replica of the Ashbourne family crest. This, he said, his voice tight with emotion, was given to me by a friend. A friend who is now dead. He told me to keep it safe, to use it as a guide. He said it would lead me to the truth. He held it out to her. Take it, Eleanor. Keep it hidden. And trust no one. Not even your own brother. Eleanor stared at the falcon, her mind reeling. Her brother? A traitor? It seemed impossible. But the look in Tristan's eyes, the urgency in his voice, told her that this was no idle accusation. He took a step back from it as if it were cursed. He then looked at her with a look of determination. I will find the truth and bring them to justice, he stated. The falcon, a symbol of her family, now seemed a symbol of something else entirely: deception, danger, and a past that refused to stay buried. Chapter 4. Scars of Loyalty. The weight of Tristan's words and the small wooden falcon now hidden within the folds of her gown pressed heavily on Eleanor. Sleep eluded her that night. The familiar comfort of her chamber felt alien. The tapestries depicting scenes of courtly love seemed to mock her own tangled reality. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside her window, sent shivers of apprehension down her spine. The following morning, Eleanor rose early, her mind already racing. She dressed simply, choosing a gown of dark blue wool, practical and unadorned. She needed to think clearly, to assess the situation without the distractions of courtly expectations. She needed to speak with her brother. She found Baron Ashbourne in his study, poring over maps and documents spread across a large oak table. He looked up as she entered, his face etched with concern. Eleanor, he said, his voice strained. You look pale. Are you unwell? She hesitated, unsure how to begin. How could she accuse her own brother of treason? How could she betray the family loyalty that had been instilled in her since birth? Tristan spoke to me last night, she said, her voice carefully neutral. Ashbourne's expression hardened. I assumed as much. He is a disruptive influence. I had hoped he would have the decency to leave Ashbourne after making his dramatic entrance. He told me he was imprisoned, Eleanor continued, watching her brother's reaction closely. That he was betrayed. Ashbourne scoffed. Betrayed? By whom? He is a knight, sworn to serve the king. Perhaps he's simply failed in his duty and seeks to blame others for his misfortunes. He said he knew too much, Eleanor pressed, her voice trembling slightly. That he was a threat. Ashbourne's eyes narrowed. A threat to whom? Eleanor? To Lord Beaumont? To our alliance? Is that what he told you? He rose from his chair and walked towards her, his movements controlled and deliberate. He placed his hands on her shoulders, his grip surprisingly firm. Eleanor, he said, his voice low and intense. You must listen to me.
Tristan de Warwick is a dangerous man.
He is a man consumed by bitterness and resentment. He will say anything, do anything, to disrupt our plans, to reclaim what he believes is his. He paused, his gaze searching hers. Do not be swayed by his words, Eleanor. Do not let your past affections cloud your judgment. Our family's future, our very survival, depends on this alliance with Lord Beaumont. Do you understand? Eleanor looked into her brother's eyes, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of the treachery Tristan had spoken of. But all she saw was concern, a fierce protectiveness that had always been a part of their relationship. He was her brother, her protector, the head of their family. Could he truly be capable of such deceit? I don't know what to believe, she whispered, her voice filled with doubt. Ashbourne sighed, his grip on her shoulders softening. Believe in me, Eleanor, he said, his voice pleading. Believe in our family. Trust me to do what is best for all of us. He released her and walked back to his table, picking up a rolled parchment. I have received a missive from Lord Beaumont. He wishes to proceed with the betrothal ceremony as soon as possible. He suggests tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Eleanor felt trapped, caught between the conflicting loyalties of her heart and her duty. She thought of Tristan, of his warning, of the small wooden falcon hidden beneath her gown. She thought of her brother, of his plea, of the years of love and trust they had shared. The scars of loyalty ran deep, cutting her to the very core. She felt a strong tugging at her heart. She could not run. She could not hide. Tomorrow she will be tested. Chapter 5. A Marriage of Necessity. The day of the betrothal dawned gray and overcast, mirroring the turmoil in Eleanor's heart. The castle was abuzz with preparations. Servants scurried through the corridors, carrying trays laden with food and flowers. Musicians tuned their instruments in the great hall, their melodies sounding strangely discordant to Eleanor's ears. She sat before her mirror, staring at her reflection. Her ladies in waiting fussed around her, arranging her hair, adjusting her gown, offering words of encouragement. But their efforts felt hollow, their words meaningless. She felt like a puppet, her strings being pulled by forces beyond her control. The gown she wore was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, a shimmering creation of ivory silk and gold lace. A heavy gold necklace, adorned with rubies and pearls, rested upon her chest. It was a gift from Lord Beaumont, a symbol of his wealth and power, a reminder of the chains that would soon bind her to him. As she looked at her reflection, she saw not a radiant bride-to-be, but a woman trapped, her spirit slowly suffocating. The image of Tristan, his face etched with pain and longing, flashed through her mind. She clutched the small wooden falcon hidden beneath her gown, its sharp edges digging into her skin. It was a tangible link to the past, a reminder of the love she had once known, a symbol of the hope she desperately clung to. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was her brother, Baron Ashbourne. He entered the room, his face a mask of solemn duty. "It is time, Eleanor," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. He offered her his arm, and she took it, her hand trembling. They walked in silence through the long corridors, their footsteps echoing on the stone floors. The sound of music and laughter grew louder as they approached the great hall. As they entered the hall, a hush fell over the assembled guests. All eyes turned towards Eleanor, their gazes filled with admiration, envy, and speculation. Lord Beaumont stood at the altar, his face beaming with pride and possessiveness. He looked every bit the powerful lord, his richly embroidered doublet straining at his expanding waistline. Eleanor felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She looked around the hall, searching for a familiar face, a sign of hope. And then she saw him. Tristan stood at the back of the hall, leaning against a stone pillar, his arms crossed. He was dressed in simple, dark clothing, his presence a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. His gaze met hers, and for a fleeting moment, time seemed to stand still. She saw the pain in his eyes, the silent plea, the unspoken promise. And in that moment, she knew she couldn't go through with it. She couldn't betray her heart, her soul, her very being. As she reached the altar, Lord Beaumont reached out to take her hand. But before he could grasp it, Eleanor pulled away. "I cannot do this," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing through the silent hall. A collective gasp rippled through the assembly. Lord Beaumont's face turned crimson, his eyes blazing with fury. Baron Ashbourne stepped forward, his expression a mixture of shock and anger. "Eleanor," he hissed, his voice low and threatening. "What are you doing?" She ignored him, her gaze fixed on Tristan. "I cannot marry a man I do not love," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I cannot betray the vows I made, even if those vows were broken by another." She turned to face the assembled guests, her head held high. "I am Lady Eleanor of Ashbourne," she declared, "and I will not be a pawn in anyone's game. My heart, my life, my future, they are my own." With that, she turned and walked towards Tristan, her steps firm and purposeful. The silence in the hall was deafening, broken only by the soft rustle of her gown and the frantic beat of her heart. The future was uncertain, dangerous, and filled with challenges. But as she reached Tristan's side and he took her hand in his, she knew she had made the right choice. She may have made many enemies on this day, but at least she was true to herself. Chapter 6. The Tournament of Shadows. The uproar that followed Eleanor's defiant refusal reverberated through Ashbourne Castle like a thunderclap. Lord Beaumont, his face contorted with rage, stormed out of the great hall, his entourage following close behind. Baron Ashbourne, torn between fury and disbelief, tried to reason with Eleanor, but she stood firm, her hand clasped tightly in Tristan's. The assembled guests were a mixture of shocked silence and whispered speculation. Some were secretly impressed by Eleanor's courage, while others condemned her actions as reckless and foolish. The air was thick with tension, the threat of violence hanging heavy in the balance. Tristan, sensing the danger, drew Eleanor closer to his side. "We must leave Ashbourne," he said, his voice low and urgent. "It is no longer safe for you here." Eleanor nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew he was right. She had defied not only Lord Beaumont, but also her brother, and the consequences of her actions could be dire. Baron Ashbourne, his face pale with anger, stepped forward. "You will go nowhere, Eleanor," he said, his voice shaking. "You are still under my protection, under my authority." "She is under my protection now," Tristan countered, his hand moving to the hilt of his sword. "And I will not hesitate to defend her, even against you, Geoffrey." The two men faced each other, their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. The tension in the hall was palpable, the air crackling with unspoken threats. Suddenly, a voice cut through the silence. "Enough!" It was Lady Margaret, Eleanor's aunt, a woman known for her wisdom and her sharp tongue. She stepped forward, her gaze sweeping over the assembled guests. "This is madness," she said, her voice firm and commanding. "We are behaving like children, squabbling over matters of pride and honor. Eleanor has made her choice, and we must respect it, whether we agree with it or not." She turned to Baron Ashbourne. "Geoffrey," she said, her voice softening slightly, "I understand your anger, your disappointment. But you cannot force Eleanor to marry a man she does not love. It is not only cruel, but it is also unwise." She paused, her gaze shifting to Tristan. "Sir Tristan," she said, her voice measured, "you have returned after a long absence, and your presence has disrupted our lives. But you are also a knight, sworn to uphold the values of chivalry and honor. I ask you, what are your intentions towards Eleanor?" Tristan met her gaze, his expression unwavering. "My intentions are honorable, Lady Margaret," he said, his voice clear and strong. "I love Eleanor, and I wish to marry her. But I will not force her, nor will I allow her to be forced by others." Lady Margaret nodded slowly. "Very well," she said. "Then I propose a solution. A way to settle this matter, without further bloodshed or animosity." She turned to address the entire hall. "I propose a tournament," she announced, her voice ringing through the silent chamber. "A tournament of champions to determine Eleanor's fate." A murmur of surprise and excitement rippled through the assembly. Tournaments were a common occurrence in medieval life, a way to display skill, courage, and honor. But this tournament was different. This tournament was about more than just sport. It was about love, loyalty, and the future of Ashbourne. "Sir Tristan will choose his champion," Lady Margaret continued. "And Lord Beaumont, if he so chooses, will choose his. The winner of the tournament will claim Eleanor's hand." Eleanor gasped. The thought of being a prize, a trophy to be won, was abhorrent to her. But she also knew that this was a way out, a chance to avoid a forced marriage, a chance to be with Tristan. The crowd erupted in cheers and support of the solution. It gave them a spectacle and a just cause. Tristan looked at Eleanor, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. "I will fight for you, Eleanor," he whispered. "I will win." But the look in her eyes showed more than just doubt. It showed fear. And so, a tournament of shadows was decided, and the fate of her life was sealed. Chapter 7. Beneath the Banners of War. The days leading up to the tournament were a whirlwind of activity. The castle grounds were transformed into a bustling arena. Stands were erected for the spectators, banners bearing the crests of Ashbourne, Beaumont, and Warwick were unfurled, and the air was filled with the clang of hammers and the shouts of workmen. Tristan, despite his vow to fight for Eleanor himself, was persuaded by Lady Margaret and, surprisingly, by Baron Ashbourne, to choose a champion. While Ashbourne remained outwardly hostile towards Tristan, He recognized the strategic advantage of having a skilled warrior represent their interests, particularly since Lord Beaumont had immediately accepted the challenge and announced his champion, Sir Kellen, a notoriously brutal knight known for his ruthlessness and his skill with a broadsword. He fights with a savagery that few can match, Ashbourne had warned, his voice grudging. You are a skilled swordsman, Tristan, but Kellen he fights to kill. Tristan, however, had already made his choice. He had sent a message to an old comrade in arms, Sir Gareth of Lyonesse, a knight renowned for his honor, his courage, and his mastery of the lance. Gareth had arrived at Ashbourne the day before the tournament, his presence a reassuring beacon of hope for Eleanor. Eleanor, meanwhile, found herself caught in a strange limbo. She was no longer betrothed to Lord Beaumont, but she was not yet free. She was the object of intense scrutiny, the subject of endless gossip and speculation. She spent her days avoiding the curious gazes of the courtiers, seeking solace in the quiet corners of the castle, and, increasingly, in the company of Tristan. They met in secret in the gardens, in the library, in the deserted chapel. They spoke of their past, of their dreams, of their fears. Tristan finally revealed the full story of his imprisonment, of the conspiracy that had led to his downfall. He told her of a powerful lord, a man close to the king, who had orchestrated the plot to silence him, to prevent him from revealing a dangerous secret. This lord, Tristan said, his voice grim, he is a serpent in the king's court. He manipulates, he deceives, he destroys anyone who stands in his way. And he is connected to Ashbourne, Eleanor. I do not yet know how, but I am certain of it. Eleanor, listening to his tale, felt a growing sense of dread. The small wooden falcon, still hidden beneath her gown, felt heavier than ever. She knew that Tristan's suspicions were not unfounded. There were secrets within her own family, dark secrets that threatened to unravel everything she held dear. On the eve of the tournament, Eleanor and Tristan met in the chapel. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows on the stone walls, creating an atmosphere of both reverence and foreboding. Tristan took her hands in his gaze filled with a tenderness that made her heart ache. Whatever happens tomorrow, Eleanor, he said, his voice low and earnest, know that I love you, and I will always fight for you, even if it is not with a sword. Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, tears welling in her eyes. I love you too, Tristan, she whispered, and I fear for you. He held her close, his arms a protective shield against the uncertainties that lay ahead. The banners of war, both literal and metaphorical, were unfurled. The tournament was more than a contest for her hand, it was a battle for truth, for justice, and for the future of their love. Beneath the shadow of those banners, their fate would be decided. The dawn will hold more than just a sunrise. It would hold the very essence of their existence. Chapter 8. The Confession in the Chapel. The morning of the tournament arrived, cold and crisp, with a hint of frost on the ground. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, the sun a weak disk struggling to break through the lingering mist. Eleanor awoke with a sense of dread, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She dressed in a simple gown of dark green, her only adornment a silver chain bearing the small wooden falcon, now worn openly as a symbol of defiance and hope. She made her way to the chapel, seeking a moment of solace before the chaos of the day began. She found Tristan there, kneeling before the altar, his head bowed in prayer. He was dressed in his armor, the polished steel gleaming in the dim light. He looked every inch the noble knight, a warrior ready to face his destiny. He rose as she entered, his face etched with a mixture of determination and concern. He took her hands in his touch warm and reassuring. Are you ready, Eleanor? He asked, his voice soft. She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I am afraid, Tristan, she whispered. Afraid for you, afraid for Gareth, afraid of what the future holds. He drew her close, his arms encircling her. Do not be afraid, he murmured. I will not let anything happen to you. And Gareth, he is the finest knight I know. He will fight with honor and courage. He paused, his gaze searching hers. There is something I must tell you, Eleanor, he said, his voice hesitant. Something I should have told you long ago. He released her and walked towards the altar, his back to her. He stood there for a moment, his shoulders slumped, as if struggling with a heavy burden. When I disappeared, he began, his voice low and strained. It was not entirely against my will. I was given a choice, a terrible choice. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. She sensed that this confession was going to change everything, that it would reveal a truth she might not be ready to hear. He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. The Lord who orchestrated my imprisonment, he offered me a deal. He said that if I agreed to disappear, to renounce my claim on you, to never contact you again, he would spare your life. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. My life? She whispered.
But why?
Because he believed that our love was a threat, Tristan said, his voice bitter. He believed that I would use my influence with the king to expose his treachery. And he knew that the only way to control me was to threaten you. He took a step closer, his gaze intense. I made a vow, Eleanor, he said, his voice trembling. A vow to protect you, even if it meant sacrificing my own happiness, my own honor. I broke my oath to you, but I kept my oath to protect you. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face. She understood now. The depth of his sacrifice, the agony he must have endured. He had chosen to protect her, even at the cost of their love. Oh, Tristan, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I did not know. He reached out and gently wiped away her tears.
I could not tell you, he said.
I was sworn to secrecy. But now that the truth is out, now that we are fighting for our future, I needed you to know. She threw her arms around him, holding him tight. I love you, Tristan, she said, her voice filled with a fierce determination. And I will never doubt you again. He held her close, his heart overflowing with love and gratitude. In the quiet sanctuary of the chapel, amidst the flickering candlelight and the echoes of their shared pain, they found a renewed strength, a deeper bond. The confession, though painful, had cleansed the wounds of the past, paving the way for a future they would fight for, together. They had each other, and that was the truest weapon of them all. Chapter 9. A Stolen Kiss in the Moonlight. The tournament was a spectacle of sound and color. The stands were packed with spectators, their cheers and jeers echoing across the field. Banners snapped in the wind. The air thrummed with the beat of drums and the blare of trumpets. Knights in shining armor, their lances lowered, charged at each other with thunderous force. Eleanor, seated in the raised viewing platform alongside Lady Margaret and a visibly subdued Baron Ashbourne, watched the proceedings with a mixture of anxiety and fascination. She saw Sir Gareth, Tristan's champion, unhorse several opponents with effortless grace. He moved with a fluidity and precision that spoke of years of training and experience. He was a formidable warrior, a true knight in every sense of the word. But she also saw Sir Kellen, Lord Beaumont's champion, fight with a brutal savagery that made her blood run cold. He seemed to take pleasure in inflicting pain, his every blow aimed to maim or kill. He left a trail of broken lances and injured knights in his wake. As the day wore on, the tension mounted. The final joust was set, Sir Gareth against Sir Kellen. The crowd roared its approval, sensing the epic clash to come. Before Gareth rode out to meet his opponent, Tristan sought Eleanor out. He found her standing alone on a small balcony overlooking the tournament grounds, her gaze fixed on the field below. He approached her quietly, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. He is a good man, Gareth, he said, his voice soft. He will fight with honor. Eleanor turned to him, her eyes filled with worry. But Kellen, he is a beast, she whispered. He fights without mercy. Tristan took her hand, his touch sending a shiver of warmth through her. Do not fear, Eleanor, he said, his gaze intense. Gareth is strong. And he is fighting for more than just victory. He is fighting for us. He drew her closer, his other hand gently cupping her face. I have waited so long for this, he murmured, his voice husky with emotion. To be with you, to hold you, to kiss you. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers. It was a tentative kiss at first, a gentle exploration, a rediscovery of a love that had been denied for so long. Then, as their lips met more fully, the kiss deepened, becoming a passionate expression of their longing, their hope, their unwavering commitment to each other. The world around them faded away. The noise of the crowd, the clash of steel, the blare of trumpets all disappeared, leaving only the two of them, locked in an embrace that transcended time and circumstance. It was a stolen moment, a brief respite from the turmoil that surrounded them, a reaffirmation of their love in the face of uncertainty. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked in a silent understanding. The kiss had sealed their bond, strengthening their resolve to face whatever challenges lay ahead. It was a promise, a vow, a testament to the enduring power of their love. It was a kiss that held all they had, all they lost, and all they hoped for. As Tristan turned to leave, to rejoin Gareth and prepare for the final joust, Eleanor reached out and touched his arm. "Be careful, Tristan," she whispered.
"Please come back to me."
He smiled, a fleeting, bittersweet smile. "Always," he said. And then he was gone. The kiss, however, lingered. It was a reminder and a weapon of its own in this subtle game of war they played. Chapter 10. The Serpent's Deception. The final joust was a brutal, heart-stopping affair. Sir Gareth, mounted on his powerful warhorse, charged at Sir Kellen with the force of a battering ram. Kellen, equally formidable, met him head-on, his lance aimed with deadly precision. The impact was deafening. Both lances shattered, splinters of wood flying through the air. The crowd gasped, their cheers turning to a collective groan as both knights were unhorsed, falling heavily to the ground. Eleanor, watching from the stands, felt her heart leap into her throat. She saw Gareth rise slowly, his movements hampered by the weight of his armor. Kellen, however, sprang to his feet with surprising agility, drawing his broadsword with a roar. The fight continued on foot, a savage dance of steel on steel. Gareth, despite his initial disadvantage, fought with skill and courage, parrying Kellen's brutal attacks, seeking an opening. Kellen, fueled by rage and a thirst for blood, pressed his advantage relentlessly, his every blow aimed to kill. Eleanor watched in horror as Kellen's sword found its mark, slicing through Gareth's armor, drawing blood. Gareth staggered, but he did not fall. He fought on, his determination unwavering, his movements fueled by a desperate hope. Suddenly, a commotion erupted in the stands. Eleanor saw her brother, Baron Ashbourne, rise to his feet, his face contorted with rage. He pointed towards a field, shouting something she couldn't quite hear over the roar of the crowd. She followed his gaze and saw it, a small, dark object lying on the ground near where Gareth had fallen. It was a vial, a small glass vial, its contents spilled across the dirt. Recognition dawned on Eleanor with sickening clarity. It was poison. The same poison that had been used to weaken Tristan years ago, the poison that had almost cost him his life. "He's been poisoned," she screamed, her voice piercing through the din. "Kellen has poisoned him." Lady Margaret, standing beside her, gasped. "By the saints!" she exclaimed. "It cannot be."
But it was.
Eleanor knew it with a certainty that chilled her to the bone. This was no ordinary tournament. This was a carefully orchestrated plot, a deception designed to eliminate Gareth and ultimately to destroy her and Tristan. She looked at her brother, her eyes filled with accusation. He avoided her gaze, his face pale and drawn. He knew. He had always known. He was part of the conspiracy. Tristan, hearing Eleanor's cry, rushed to the edge of the field, his face a mask of fury. He vaulted over the barrier, drawing his own sword. He was about to intervene, to challenge Kellen himself, when a figure stepped in front of him. It was Baron Ashbourne. "No," Tristan Ashbourne said, his voice surprisingly calm. "This is my fight now." He drew his own sword, a magnificent weapon, inlaid with gold and jewels. He turned to face Kellen, his expression resolute. "You have dishonored yourself, Kellen," Ashbourne said, his voice ringing through the silent arena. "You have broken the laws of chivalry. and you will pay the price." The crowd was stunned into silence. Ashbourne, the man who had seemed so opposed to Tristan, was now challenging Kellen, the champion of his own intended ally. The serpent's deception had been revealed, not by Tristan, but by the actions of Eleanor's own brother. The truth, like a venomous snake, had finally slithered out into the open, its fangs bared for all to see. The upcoming fight would show if it was too late. Chapter 11. The Price of Honor. The duel between Baron Ashbourne and Sir Kellen was a stark contrast to the previous bouts. It was not a display of skill or pageantry, but a grim, desperate struggle for survival. Ashbourne, though not as seasoned a warrior as Kellen, fought with a ferocity born of guilt and a desperate need for redemption. He knew he had betrayed his sister, betrayed his family, betrayed his own honor. This was his chance to atone, to reclaim some semblance of the man he once was. Kellen, enraged by Ashbourne's intervention and the accusation of treachery, fought with a savage brutality. He saw Ashbourne as a weakling, a nobleman playing at being a warrior. He aimed to make an example of him, to crush him utterly and reclaim his victory. The clash of steel echoed through the arena, the grunts and cries of the combatants punctuating the tense silence of the crowd. Eleanor watched, her heart in her throat, her hands clasped tightly together. She saw the determination in her brother's eyes, the desperation in his movements. She also saw the cold, calculating cruelty in Kellen's gaze. Ashbourne fought bravely, parrying Kellen's relentless attacks, seeking an opening. But Kellen was too strong, too skilled. He pressed his advantage, driving Ashbourne back, forcing him to defend himself desperately. A gasp went up from the crowd as Kellen's sword found its mark, slicing through Ashbourne's armor, drawing blood. Ashbourne staggered, but he did not fall. He raised his sword again, his face pale and drawn, his movements sluggish. Eleanor wanted to scream, to beg him to stop, to yield. But she knew he wouldn't. He had chosen his path, and he would see it through to the bitter end. Tristan, standing beside Eleanor, watched the duel with a mixture of anguish and grim respect. He knew Ashbourne's actions were a form of suicide, a desperate attempt to atone for his sins. He also knew that he could not intervene, that this was Ashbourne's fight, his final act of defiance. The end came swiftly, brutally. Kellen, with a roar of triumph, disarmed Ashbourne, sending his sword flying across the field. He stood over him, his broadsword raised, ready to deliver the killing blow. Eleanor closed her eyes, unable to watch. A collective groan rose from the crowd, a sound of horror and despair. But the killing blow never came. Instead, a different sound echoed through the arena, the sharp, clear ring of steel on steel. Eleanor opened her eyes and saw a sight that made her heart leap with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Tristan had intervened. He had not challenged Kellen directly, but he had deflected his blow, his sword meeting Kellen's with a force that sent vibrations through the air. "Enough!" Tristan roared, his voice filled with righteous anger. "This farce is over." He turned to face the stunned crowd, his gaze sweeping over the assembled lords and ladies. "This tournament was a sham," he declared. "A plot orchestrated by those who seek to control Ashbourne, to control the king. Sir Kellen fought with poison, a dishonorable act. And Baron Ashbourne he knew. He was part of the conspiracy." He paused, his gaze locking with Eleanor's. "But he has redeemed himself," he continued, his voice softening slightly. "He has paid the price of his honor." He turned back to Kellen, his sword pointed at the knight's throat. "Yield, Kellen," he said, his voice cold and deadly.
"Or die."
Kellen, his face a mask of rage and fear, hesitated for a moment. But he saw the determination in Tristan's eyes, the unwavering resolve. He knew he was defeated. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his sword. The price of honor had been paid, not in gold or land, but in blood and sacrifice. The truth had been revealed, the serpent's deception exposed. But the battle was far from over. The consequences of the day's events would ripple through the kingdom, shaking the very foundations of power. The aftermath had arrived, and it was more dreadful than the action. Chapter 12. The Hunt in the Mistwood. The immediate aftermath of the tournament was chaos. Lord Beaumont, furious and humiliated, departed Ashbourne with his entourage, vowing revenge. The king's representatives, who had been present to witness the spectacle, ordered Sir Kellen's arrest and promised a full investigation into the allegations of poisoning and conspiracy. Baron Ashbourne, severely wounded but alive, was taken to his chambers, where the castle healer tended to his injuries. Eleanor, exhausted and emotionally drained, found herself torn between relief and a lingering sense of dread. Tristan's actions had saved her brother's life, had exposed the treachery that had permeated Ashbourne, but she knew that the true perpetrators of the plot remained at large, their power and influence still a threat. Tristan, sensing her unease, sought her out in the castle gardens, where she had retreated to find some semblance of peace. He found her sitting by the fountain, her gaze fixed on the swirling water. "He will live," Tristan said, his voice soft, as he sat beside her. "The healer says his wounds are serious, but not life-threatening." Eleanor nodded, her eyes filled with tears. I misjudged him," she whispered. "I thought he had betrayed me completely, but he tried to make amends." "He did," Tristan agreed. "He paid a heavy price for his mistakes." He took her hand, his touch gentle and reassuring. "But the danger is not over, Eleanor," he said, his voice serious. "The Lord who orchestrated this plot, he will not let this go unpunished. He will strike again." Eleanor shivered, a sense of foreboding washing over her. "Who is he, Tristan?" she asked. "Who is this man who holds so much power, who is so determined to destroy us?" Tristan hesitated, his gaze searching hers. "I do not know his identity for certain," he said, "but I have my suspicions, and I intend to uncover the truth." He rose to his feet, his expression determined. "I am leaving Ashbourne," he announced. "I am going to hunt down this serpent, to expose him and bring him to justice." Eleanor's heart sank. "Leaving?" she whispered. "But where will you go?" "To the Mistwood," Tristan replied. "It is a place of ancient secrets, a place where those who seek to hide from the king's justice often flee. I have heard whispers, rumors, that connect this lord to the Mistwood. I must follow those whispers, see where they lead." "But it is dangerous," Eleanor protested. "The Mistwood is a wild, untamed place, filled with outlaws and other things." Tristan smiled, a fleeting, bittersweet smile. "I am a knight, Eleanor," he said. "Danger is my companion, and I have faced worse than outlaws." He took her hand again, his gaze intense. "I will return, Eleanor," he promised.
I will not leave you again.
"But I must do this. For you, for Ashbourne, for the kingdom." He leaned down and kissed her, a brief, passionate kiss that spoke of his love and his determination. Then, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the castle. Eleanor watched him go, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and hope. The hunt in the Mistwood had begun, a perilous journey into the heart of darkness, a quest to uncover the truth and bring a powerful enemy to justice. She knew that Tristan's path would be fraught with danger, that he would face challenges that would test his courage and his resolve. But she also knew that he would not give up, that he would fight for her, for their future, until his last breath. She could only pray and wait. She touched her lips where he had kissed her. It was a tether. She held on to it tightly, waiting for his hunt to end. Chapter 13. Echoes of Betrayal. The days following Tristan's departure were long and agonizing for Eleanor. She remained at Ashbourne, tending to her brother's recovery, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy amidst the turmoil that had engulfed their lives. Baron Ashbourne, though physically weak, was slowly regaining his strength. The near-death experience had changed him, humbled him. He was no longer the arrogant, ambitious lord he had once been. He was a man haunted by his mistakes, burdened by guilt, seeking redemption. He and Eleanor spoke little of the events that had transpired. The wounds were still too raw, the trust too fragile. But there was a new understanding between them, a shared sense of loss and a tentative hope for the future. Eleanor spent much of her time in the castle library, poring over old documents, family histories, seeking any clue that might shed light on the identity of the mysterious lord who had orchestrated the plot against Tristan. She discovered references to a long-standing feud between the Ashbourne family and another noble house, a house whose name had been all but erased from the official records. There were whispers of dark secrets, of forbidden alliances, of a thirst for revenge that spanned generations. One evening, as she was sitting by the fire in her chamber, reading a particularly cryptic passage in an ancient chronicle, she heard a soft knock on the door. It was Lady Margaret, her aunt, her face etched with concern. "Eleanor," she said, her voice low, "I have something to tell you. Something I should have told you long ago." Eleanor put down the book, her heart pounding in her chest. She sensed that this was another piece of the puzzle, another revelation that would bring her closer to the truth. Lady Margaret sat down beside her, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Your father," she began, her voice hesitant, "he was not the man you believe him to be. He was involved in things, dark things. He made enemies, powerful enemies." Eleanor listened in stunned silence as Lady Margaret recounted a tale of ambition, betrayal, and a secret pact made with a shadowy figure known only as the Serpent. This serpent, Lady Margaret explained, was a master manipulator, a man who controlled events from behind the scenes, a man who had a long and twisted history with the Ashbourne family. "Your father," Lady Margaret continued, "he tried to break free from the serpent's grasp. But it was too late. He had already become entangled in his web of deceit. And he paid the ultimate price." Eleanor's mind reeled. Her father, the man she had admired and respected, had been a pawn in a dangerous game, a game that had ultimately led to his death. And now, that same game was threatening her, threatening Tristan, threatening everyone she held dear. "The serpent," Lady Margaret said, her voice trembling, "he is still out there, Eleanor. And he is seeking revenge. He believes that Ashbourne owes him a debt that can only be repaid in blood." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. The echoes of betrayal reverberated through the generations, the past reaching out to claim the present. She understood now the depth of the danger they faced, the power of the enemy they were up against. "We must find him, Eleanor," Lady Margaret said, her voice filled with a desperate urgency. "We must expose him before he destroys us all." Eleanor nodded, her resolve hardening. She would not be a victim, a pawn in someone else's game. She would fight back. She would uncover the truth. She would protect those she loved. The hunt for the serpent had taken on a new urgency, a personal dimension. It was no longer just about Tristan's quest, it was about her own family's history, her own survival. It was a race against time, a battle against a hidden enemy who lurked in the shadows, waiting to strike. She clutched the small wooden falcon, no longer hiding it. It was a reminder, and now a symbol of all she had to do. Chapter 14. The Letter and the Locket. A week after Lady Margaret's revelation, a messenger arrived at Ashbourne, bearing a sealed letter for Eleanor. The messenger, a young man with weary eyes and dust-stained clothes, claimed to have ridden day and night from the Mistwood. Eleanor's heart leaped with a mixture of hope and trepidation as she took the letter, recognizing Tristan's seal on the wax. She dismissed the messenger and retreated to her chamber, her hands trembling as she broke the seal. The letter was written in Tristan's familiar, bold script, but the words were terse and urgent. "Eleanor, I have found him. Or rather, I have found his lair. The serpent is indeed connected to the Mistwood, as I suspected. He operates from a hidden fortress, deep within the forest, a place known only to a few. I have gathered evidence, proof of his treachery, but I am being hunted. My enemies are closing in. I am sending this letter with a trusted companion, a woodsman who knows the Mistwood well. He will guide you to me, if you choose to come. But be warned, Eleanor, the journey is perilous. The Mistwood is a dangerous place, and the serpent's reach is long. If you do not hear from me within a fortnight, assume the worst. The evidence I have gathered is hidden within a locket, a silver locket shaped like a falcon. It is the key to exposing the serpent's treachery. If I fall, you must find the locket and deliver it to the king. It is the only way to ensure justice is served. I love you, Eleanor. Always. Tristan. Eleanor read the letter again and again, her mind racing. Tristan was in danger, his life hanging in the balance. She had to go to him, to help him, to protect him. But the journey to the Mistwood was fraught with peril. She would be risking her own life, walking into a trap. She looked down at the small wooden falcon she wore around her neck, the symbol of her family's troubled past, the symbol of her love for Tristan. She made her decision. She summoned the woodsman, the messenger who had brought Tristan's letter. He was a taciturn man, his face weathered and scarred, his eyes filled with a wary intelligence. "Can you guide me to Sir Tristan?" she asked, her voice firm and resolute. The woodsman nodded. "Aye, my lady," he said, "but it will be a dangerous journey. The Mistwood is not a place for the faint of heart." "I am not faint of heart," Eleanor replied, her gaze unwavering. "I am Lady Eleanor of Ashbourne, and I will not abandon the man I love." She spent the next few hours preparing for the journey. She packed a small bag with supplies, chose a sturdy riding dress and cloak, and armed herself with a dagger, which she concealed beneath her cloak. She informed Lady Margaret of her plans, leaving her in charge of Ashbourne and her recovering brother. Before she left, she visited Baron Ashbourne in his chambers. He was still weak, but his eyes were clear, his expression remorseful. "Eleanor," he said, his voice hoarse, I am sorry. For everything." She took his hand, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and forgiveness. "I know," she said, "and I forgive you. But you must rest, recover. And when I return, we will face this together." She kissed him on the forehead, then turned and left Ashbourne, riding alongside the woodsman, heading towards the dark and forbidding embrace of the Mistwood. The letter and the locket, symbols of hope and danger, were her guide. The future was uncertain, but her resolve was not. She rode towards love and destiny. Chapter 15. Flight from Ashbourne. The journey to the Mistwood was arduous and fraught with peril. The woodsman, true to his word, guided Eleanor through treacherous terrain, avoiding the main roads and sticking to hidden paths known only to him. They rode through dense forests, across rushing rivers, and over steep, rocky hills. The weather was unforgiving, with cold winds and frequent rain showers adding to their discomfort. Eleanor, despite her noble upbringing, proved to be a resilient and resourceful traveler. She endured the hardships without complaint, her determination fueled by her love for Tristan and her unwavering commitment to bringing the serpent to justice. She learned from the woodsman, picking up skills necessary for survival in the wild, learning to identify edible plants, to track animals, to build a fire in the dampest conditions. As they journeyed deeper into the Mistwood, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The trees were ancient and gnarled, their branches intertwined, blocking out most of the sunlight. The air was thick with mist, creating an eerie, ethereal quality. Strange sounds echoed through the forest, the hooting of owls, the rustling of unseen creatures, the occasional howl of a wolf. One evening, as they were making camp in a small clearing, the woodsman spoke, his voice low and cautious. "We are close, my lady," he said. "Close to the serpent's lair. But we must be careful. His men are everywhere. They patrol the forest, watching for intruders." Eleanor nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew they were entering the most dangerous phase of their journey. "How will we find Tristan?" she asked. He said he was being hunted. The woodsman pointed to a faint trail, barely visible amidst the undergrowth. "He left signs," he said. "Markers that only those who know what to look for can see. We will follow those markers. They will lead us to him." They continued their journey the following day, moving with even greater caution, avoiding any contact with other travelers. They saw signs of the serpent's men footprints, discarded campfires, the occasional glimpse of a cloaked figure in the distance. As dusk began to settle, they reached a steep, rocky cliff face. The woodsman pointed to a narrow crevice, almost hidden by a curtain of ivy. "This is it," he said. "The entrance to the serpent's lair. Tristan must be inside." Eleanor felt a surge of both hope and fear. She was close to Tristan, close to reuniting with him, but she was also walking into a trap, facing an enemy who was powerful and ruthless. She took a deep breath, steeling her resolve. "Let us go," she said, her voice firm. She followed the woodsman into the crevice, her hand on the hilt of her dagger, her senses on high alert. The flight from Ashbourne had ended. The confrontation was about to begin. She stepped from the familiar into darkness, with nothing but her courage. Chapter 16. Sanctuary in the Abbey. The crevice led to a narrow, winding passage, carved into the rock. The air was cold and damp, the silence broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water. Eleanor followed the woodsman, her hand brushing against the rough stone walls, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what awaited them at the end of the passage, but she knew it would not be pleasant. After what seemed like an eternity, the passage opened into a large, cavernous chamber. The chamber was dimly lit by torches, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. Eleanor saw several figures huddled around a fire, their faces grim and wary. They were dressed in rough clothing, their weapons close at hand. They were clearly outlaws, men who lived on the fringes of society, men who owed their allegiance to the serpent. As Eleanor and the woodsman entered the chamber, the outlaws rose to their feet, their hands moving to their swords. The woodsman raised his hand, signaling for them to stop. "We seek Tristan de Warwick," he said, his voice calm but firm. "He is a friend. We mean you no harm." The outlaws exchanged wary glances. One of them, a tall, muscular man with a scarred face, stepped forward. "Tristan is not here," he said, his voice gruff. "He was captured by the serpent's men. They took him to the fortress." Eleanor's heart sank. She had arrived too late. Tristan was in the hands of their enemy. "We must rescue him," she said, her voice filled with a desperate urgency. "We must get to the fortress." The scarred outlaw shook his head. "The fortress is impenetrable," he said. "No one has ever escaped from it. It is a death trap." "There must be a way," Eleanor insisted. "We cannot abandon him." The woodsman stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the outlaw. "There is a way," he said. "A secret way, known only to a few. But it is dangerous. Very dangerous." He paused, his eyes searching Eleanor's. "Are you willing to risk it, my lady?" he asked. Eleanor did not hesitate. "Yes," she said. "I am willing to risk anything to save Tristan." The outlaw nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Very well," he said. "But first you must rest. You have traveled far, and you will need your strength. We will provide you with food and shelter. And tomorrow, we will show you the secret way." The outlaws led Eleanor and the woodsman to a smaller chamber, a makeshift sleeping area. They offered them food and water, and then left them to rest. Eleanor, exhausted and emotionally drained, tried to sleep, but her mind was racing. She was so close to Tristan, yet so far. She had to find a way to reach him, to rescue him from the serpent's clutches. Suddenly, she heard a noise, a soft rustling sound. She sat up, her hand reaching for her dagger. A figure emerged from the shadows, a figure she recognized instantly. It was Tristan. "Tristan," she gasped, her voice filled with disbelief and relief. He rushed towards her, his arms encircling her. "Eleanor," he whispered. "You came. You actually came." He held her tight, his heart overflowing with love and gratitude. He was bruised and battered, his clothes torn, but he was alive.
"But how?"
Eleanor stammered. "They said you were captured." "I escaped," Tristan said, his voice low. "With the help of a friend." He gestured towards the entrance of the chamber, where another figure was emerging from the shadows. It was a woman, dressed in the simple garb of a nun. "This is Sister Agnes," Tristan said. "She helped me escape from the fortress. She is part of a secret order, an order that opposes the serpent." Sister Agnes, a woman with a serene face and kind eyes, bowed her head. "We have been watching the serpent for a long time," she said. "We know his ways, and we know how to defeat him." Eleanor looked from Tristan to Sister Agnes, her mind reeling. She had found sanctuary, not in a castle or a fortress, but in an abbey hidden within the heart of the Mistwood, an abbey dedicated to fighting the very evil she had come to confront. Chapter 17. The King's Decree. Sister Agnes explained that the abbey was a refuge for those who opposed the serpent and his corrupting influence. It was a hidden sanctuary, a place where the flame of truth and justice still burned brightly. The nuns, though seemingly devoted to a life of prayer and contemplation, were also skilled in the arts of healing, espionage, and even combat. They had been secretly working to undermine the serpent's power for years, gathering information, protecting his enemies, and preparing for the day when they could finally expose him. Tristan, with Sister Agnes's help, had managed to retrieve the locket containing the evidence he had gathered against the serpent. It was a small, silver locket, shaped like a falcon, just as he had described in his letter. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a rolled-up parchment, sealed with the serpent's own signet ring. "This," Tristan said, his voice grim, "is the proof we need. This document contains the names of all those involved in the serpent's conspiracy, including the lord who orchestrated my imprisonment and your father's downfall." Eleanor took the locket, her hands trembling. It was a tangible link to the past, a symbol of hope and justice, a weapon that could finally bring down their enemy. "We must get this to the king," she said, her voice firm. "We must expose the serpent and all his followers." Sister Agnes nodded. "But the journey to the king's court will be perilous," she said. "The serpent has spies everywhere. He will stop at nothing to prevent you from reaching the king." She paused, her gaze thoughtful. "There is another way," she said. "A way to bring the king to us." She explained that the king was currently on a royal progress, traveling through the kingdom, holding court in various towns and cities. He was scheduled to visit a nearby town, just a few days' ride from Mistwood, in the coming week. "If we can send a message to the king," Sister Agnes said, "a message that convinces him of the danger, of the serpent's treachery, he might be persuaded to come to the Mistwood, to meet with us here in secret." Tristan and Eleanor exchanged glances. It was a risky plan, but it was their best chance. They couldn't risk traveling to the king's court, not with the serpent's spies lurking everywhere. "We will do it," Tristan said. "We will send a message to the king, and we will convince him to come." Sister Agnes provided them with parchment, ink, and a wax seal bearing the abbey's insignia, a cross intertwined with a serpent, symbolizing their fight against evil. Tristan and Eleanor worked together, crafting a carefully worded message, outlining the serpent's conspiracy, the evidence they possessed, and the urgent need for the king to meet with them in secret. They entrusted the message to one of the abbey's most trusted messengers, a young nun disguised as a traveling merchant. She set off the following morning, carrying the message and their hopes with her. Days turned into an agonizing wait. Eleanor, Tristan, and Sister Agnes prepared for the king's arrival, strengthening the abbey's defenses, gathering supplies, and praying for the messenger's success. Finally, on the evening of the 6th day, the messenger returned. She was exhausted and travel-worn, but her eyes were shining with triumph. "The king has received the message," she announced, "and he has agreed to come. He will arrive at dawn, 2 days hence, with a small, trusted escort." A wave of relief washed over Eleanor and Tristan. Their plan had worked. The king was coming. The final confrontation was at hand. The king's decree to meet was not just a summons, it was the beginning of the end. Chapter 18. The Battle for Her Heart. The 2 days leading up to the king's arrival were filled with a tense anticipation. The abbey was a hive of activity, with the nuns and the outlaws working together to prepare for the momentous meeting. Defenses were strengthened, supplies were gathered, and plans were made for every possible contingency. Eleanor and Tristan, despite the looming confrontation, found moments of solace in each other's company. They walked in the abbey's small, secluded garden, their hands clasped, their conversations a mixture of hope and fear. They spoke of their future, of the life they hoped to build together, once the serpent was defeated. "After all this is over," Tristan said, his voice soft, "I want to take you away from all this. Away from the court, away from the intrigues, away from the dangers. I want to build a home for us, a place of peace and happiness. Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart filled with a bittersweet longing. I want that too, Tristan, she whispered. More than anything. But even in those moments of intimacy, the shadow of the serpent loomed large. They knew that the upcoming meeting with the king was a gamble, a dangerous game with the highest stakes. The serpent would not give up easily. He would fight to protect his power, his influence, his very existence. On the eve of the king's arrival, as Eleanor was preparing for bed, she heard a soft knock on her door. It was Sister Agnes, her face etched with concern. Eleanor, she said, her voice low, I have received troubling news. Our scouts have reported that the serpent's men are gathering in the mistwood. They know the king is coming, and they're planning an ambush. Eleanor's heart sank. She had feared this, expected it. But the reality of the threat was still a blow. What can we do? She asked, her voice trembling. We must warn the king, Sister Agnes said. And we must prepare to defend ourselves. The abbey may be hidden, but it is not impregnable. Tristan, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward. I will ride out to meet the king, he said. I will warn him of the danger and guide him safely to the abbey. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with fear. No, Tristan, she said. It is too dangerous. You cannot go alone. I will not be alone, Tristan said. I will take some of the outlaws with me, men who know the mistwood well. We will be careful, and we will be back before dawn. He took her hands in his gaze intense. Trust me, Eleanor, he said. I will not let anything happen to you, or to the king. He kissed her, a brief, passionate kiss that spoke of his love and his determination. Then, he turned and left, disappearing into the darkness. Eleanor watched him go, her heart filled with a mixture of dread and admiration. He was risking his life, again, to protect her, to protect the king, to protect the kingdom. She spent the rest of the night in prayer, praying for Tristan's safety, praying for the king's arrival, praying for the defeat of the serpent. The battle for her heart, for the kingdom, for justice, had begun long ago. But tonight, it would reach its climax. It was a battle not of swords, but of loyalty and wills. And she could do nothing but wait. Chapter 19. The Lion and the Rose. Dawn broke gray and misty, the air thick with anticipation. Eleanor stood on the abbey walls, alongside Sister Agnes, watching the path that led through the mistwood. The silence was broken only by the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of fear and hope churning within her. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the mist, riding a powerful warhorse. It was Tristan. Behind him, she saw a small group of riders, their armor gleaming in the dim light. It was the king and his escort. A wave of relief washed over Eleanor. Tristan had succeeded. He had reached the king and guided him safely to the abbey. As the king approached, Eleanor descended from the walls and went to greet him. He was a tall, imposing figure with a stern face and piercing blue eyes. He wore a simple, travel-worn cloak over his armor, but there was no mistaking his regal bearing. Lady Eleanor, the king said, his voice deep and resonant, as he dismounted. We have received your message, and we have come to hear the truth. Eleanor bowed her head. Your Majesty, she said, we are grateful for your presence. We have much to tell you. She led the king and his escort into the abbey's main hall, where Tristan, Sister Agnes, and the leaders of the outlaws were waiting. The king listened intently as Tristan and Eleanor recounted the events of the past months, the conspiracy that had threatened Ashbourne, the treachery that had reached into the very heart of the kingdom. Tristan presented the locket, the silver falcon, to the king. He opened it, revealing the rolled-up parchment, the serpent's own seal clearly visible. The king unrolled the parchment and began to read, his face growing increasingly pale with each passing moment. The names of his closest advisors, his most trusted lords, were listed there, implicated in the serpent's plot. He looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and fury. This is treason, he said, his voice shaking. Treason of the highest order. He turned to Tristan and Eleanor, his gaze filled with gratitude. You have done a great service to the kingdom, he said. You have exposed a cancer that threatened to destroy us all. Suddenly, a commotion erupted outside the abbey. The sound of shouting, the clash of steel, the screams of men. The serpent's men had found them. The king's guards rushed to defend the abbey, their swords drawn. Tristan and the outlaws joined the fray, fighting with a ferocity born of desperation and a thirst for justice. Eleanor, armed with her dagger, stood beside Sister Agnes, ready to defend the abbey, ready to protect the king. The battle raged, a chaotic melee of steel and blood. As the fighting intensified, a figure emerged from the chaos, a tall, imposing figure dressed in black armor. It was the serpent. Eleanor recognized him instantly, from the descriptions she had heard, from the chilling aura of power and malice that surrounded him. It was Lord Malvern, a man she'd often met in court in her younger days, one of the king's inner circle. He saw Eleanor, his eyes narrowing with hatred. He raised his sword, ready to strike her down. But before he could reach her, another figure intervened. It was Baron Ashbourne. He had ridden from Ashbourne, despite his wounds, determined to join the fight, to finally redeem himself. He engaged the serpent in a duel, their swords clashing with a deafening roar. Ashbourne, though weakened, fought with a courage and determination he had never shown before. But the serpent was too strong, too skilled. He disarmed Ashbourne, sending his sword flying across the hall. He stood over him, his sword raised, ready to deliver the killing blow. Before he could strike, a figure leaped in front and deflected the blow. It was Eleanor. Time slowed. She could see the surprise and hatred on the face of Lord Malvern. Eleanor and the serpent fought. She moved with a speed that was almost supernatural. She had always lived with a fire inside, but now it was truly visible. She disarmed the serpent and had her dagger to his throat. The king ordered the arrest of the serpent and all his followers. The battle was over. The lion, representing the king, and the rose, for Eleanor, had stood and fought. The serpent was defeated. Justice, at long last, would be served. Chapter 20. A vow renewed. The days that followed the battle at the abbey were a time of reckoning and renewal. The king, with the evidence provided by Tristan and Eleanor, swiftly moved to purge his court of the serpent's followers. Lord Malvern, stripped of his titles and lands, was imprisoned, awaiting trial for treason. The conspiracy that had threatened to destabilize the kingdom was shattered, its architects brought to justice. Baron Ashbourne, having survived his wounds and proven his loyalty, was pardoned by the king and restored to his position, though he carried the scars of his past mistakes as a constant reminder of the price of ambition and deceit. He began the slow, arduous process of rebuilding his reputation and restoring honor to the Ashbourne name. Eleanor, hailed as a heroine for her courage and her unwavering commitment to justice, found herself in a position of newfound respect and influence. She had faced down a powerful enemy, had risked her life to protect those she loved, and had emerged victorious. She was no longer simply Lady Eleanor of Ashbourne. She was Eleanor the Brave, Eleanor the Just. Tristan, his name cleared, his honor restored, was offered a position of high command in the king's army. But he declined, choosing instead to return to Ashbourne with Eleanor. He had fought his battles, had faced his demons, and had found his true purpose, to build a life with the woman he loved, a life free from the shadows of the past. As the dust settled and the kingdom began to heal, Eleanor and Tristan stood together in the gardens of Ashbourne Castle, the same gardens where they had once shared stolen moments of young love. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the landscape. Tristan took Eleanor's hands in his gaze filled with a tenderness that made her heart ache with happiness. "We have been through so much," he said, his voice soft. "So much pain, so much loss, so much uncertainty." He paused, his thumb gently caressing her hand. "But we survived," he continued. "We found our way back to each other, and we are stronger for it." He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small, familiar object. It was the gold cross he had given her years ago, the cross she had worn throughout their separation, the cross that had symbolized his vow to return. "I broke that vow once," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I was forced to break it to protect you. But I will never break another vow to you, Eleanor. I swear it." He knelt before her, holding out the cross. "Eleanor of Ashbourne," he said, his voice filled with love and devotion. "Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Will you share your life with me for all the days to come?" Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, tears of joy, tears of relief, tears of a love that had endured the trials of time and treachery. "Yes, Tristan," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I will." He slipped the cross around her neck, its warmth a comforting presence against her skin. He rose to his feet and took her in his arms, their lips meeting in a kiss that sealed their renewed vow, a kiss that spoke of a future filled with hope, with peace, with a love that had been tested and found true. A vow renewed, under a setting sun, marked the beginning of their forever. It was a perfect ending to a long trial.
Epilogue.
Years passed, and Ashbourne Castle, once shadowed by secrets and betrayal, flourished under the stewardship of Eleanor and Tristan. They ruled wisely and justly, their love for each other and their commitment to their people a beacon of hope and stability in a turbulent world. Eleanor bore Tristan several children, strong sons and daughters who inherited their parents' courage, their compassion, and their unwavering sense of justice. The halls of Ashbourne rang with laughter and the sounds of family, the echoes of the past replaced by the promise of the future. Baron Ashbourne, a changed man, remained a close advisor and confidant to Eleanor and Tristan. He never remarried, dedicating his life to serving his family and his people, atoning for his past mistakes through acts of kindness and generosity. He found a quiet redemption, not in power or glory, but in the simple act of living a life of honor and service. The story of Eleanor and Tristan, the knight who broke his oath and the lady who defied convention, became a legend, whispered in castle halls and around cottage fires, a testament to the enduring power of love, loyalty, and courage. It was a story of second chances, of redemption, of the triumph of good over evil. On a warm summer evening, many years after the battle at the Abbey, Eleanor and Tristan stood together on the castle walls, overlooking the lands they had sworn to protect. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the fields and forests, a scene reminiscent of the day they had renewed their vows. Tristan, his hair now streaked with silver, his face etched with the lines of time and experience, took Eleanor's hand in his. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a love that had only deepened with the passing years. "We did it, Eleanor," he said, his voice soft. "We built a life together, a life of peace and happiness, just as we promised." Eleanor smiled, her heart overflowing with gratitude. "Yes, we did," she said. "And we did it together." They stood there for a long moment, their hands clasped, their shoulders touching, watching the sunset paint the sky with vibrant colors. They had faced down their demons, had overcome adversity, had found their way back to each other. They had built a legacy of love, a legacy that would endure for generations to come. Their love had been a beacon of hope in a world that often had little light. It was a love that prevailed. They were together, finally and eternally. And that was all that truly mattered.